Alright, how's it going, everyone? And welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. Try to check out great theories, discoveries, and concepts, kind of everything. Things that you probably don't know about because they've been suppressed, but if you did, they would make a great difference in your overall outlook and maybe allow you to make some changes in your life that would benefit you. Today is our number 299 Bible Decode. We've been mostly grousing about the New Testament, especially in light of the Roman origins hypothesis that has many different adherents. But probably the most popular is Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. We've also gone through several other works, older and newer, that all purport to claim that the New Testament, in whole or in part, was written by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, and in fact they were the only people that even could have written the New Testament because they had total control of censorship, publishing, and distribution within the Roman Empire in the first century, and that nobody was writing anything in that time period unless it had the sanction of Caesar. But that is just circumstantial evidence. There is a ton of direct evidence that comes directly from the scriptures, especially the book of Luke. But in order to kind of decode Luke, you need to also read the 7-volume history called War of the Jews by Josephus. And you may know about Josephus if you're a Christian because he is bandied about by apologists as the corroborating evidence for the existence of Jesus, because he is a secular scholar who also mentioned the existence of Jesus, even though he did so a couple generations after the said events, and was not an eyewitness to the events, and did so just as an aside, and also is also known as Flavius Josephus, meaning that he is from the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. So he was an actual adopted family member of the Caesars. And so when you get into the Roman origins hypothesis, then you can really think that he's just in on it with them. It's a psychological operation. And in fact, all of the scholars who have mentioned the existence of Jesus, who have corroborating evidence of the existence of Jesus of the first 100 years after the said events, they are all Roman Caesars, or denizens of the court of Caesar. And that includes Tacitus and Pliny the Younger and Emperor Trajan himself, and Suetonius, who according to some sources may also have been Emperor Antoninus Pius, who was the Roman emperor from 137 to 161 AD. In any case, we've also looked at in detail about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they fit into the whole picture, discovered in the late 1940s. These almost 2,000-year-old documents, and where did they come from? And they are generally thought to, they were discovered in a series of caves near Qumran, and they were kind of suppressed. They were of, priceless value, but they were given, the custody of them was given to a group of Dominican priests, primarily, who must have seen something that they didn't like, and so they decided to monopolize and hoard the documents without translating any of them or publishing any of them for over 40 years, until legal action was commenced to them, and they finally saw the light of day in the late 80s, early 1990s, and there has been some scholarship on them since then, and now I'm becoming aware that there is a school of thought that these people that were living in this fortress or this monastery at Qumran, they may not have been the people who wrote these things. They may have been, now you may know that Titus, the emperor, who was a general at the time for the Romans during the war between the Romans and the Jews, 66 to 73 AD, he destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD and raided the temple, took everything out of the temple, and enslaved all the Jews, brought them to Rome, and, made many of them participate in the chariot races and the Christians versus lions, so-called, which were really Jews versus lions, and used all of their gold and all of the wealth of that temple to build all the Roman structures, including the Colosseum is one of the things that the Flavians built. And, but anyway, so they may have, either the Jews or even the Romans may have deposited these documents in these in these caves. They're only about 12 miles from Jerusalem, so so they may not be from this ascetic, pious, celibate sect that it's claimed to be, and they certainly weren't Essenes. Essenes is just a term that people like to link Jesus with, thinking that he was from this sect of really holy, pious people. But the only people that have ever mentioned the Essenes in the history of literature are all Romans, Caesars, or their court denizens, such as, again, Josephus, and this time Pliny the Elder, and also Philo Judaeus of Alexandria, who was one of the richest families in the world and had a very strong connection with the Roman emperors. Anyway, now we are on to a different book, which kind of helps, also kind of a repressed opinion that gets into the context of the Bible. Your pastor or reverend is probably going to tell you, just read your Bible. But I found, at least when I read the Bible, I didn't get very much out of it because I didn't understand what the hell they're talking about. Who are these people? And I'm asking all these questions. And not only that, but by the time I read these scriptures, especially the Old Testament, I had already read other stuff. And so when I'm reading even just Adam and Eve, I'm like, yeah, well, I've heard this story before. This is not original. This is in other mythologies that are much older than the Bible purports to be. And, when I'm reading the New Testament, I'm like, I need something more than this. Who are these people? You keep referring to these random people, especially in the book of Acts and the Pauline material. What are you talking about? Who are these people? And I'm just looking for some context. I'm a historian, so I want to know. I don't want to just read something in a vacuum. But your priest or pastor will tell you that you don't need to know this stuff. And you just read your Bible. They also won't tell you that there are dozens of other gospels in addition to the 4 that are given to you in the Bible. There are dozens of other books of Acts in addition to the one that's given to you in the Bible. There are dozens of other epistles in addition to those 13 that are given to you in the Bible. And there are dozens of other revelations in addition to the one that are given to you. And hardly a Christian has even any curiosity as to what those other ones say. And I just keep harping on this, but you would think that anybody who is in search of truth, in search of actual truth instead of some kind of comfort or some kind of numbing device or something, would be searching out these other documents to find out what they actually say about their Lord and Savior. Whether they're true or not. You want to read the fiction as well as the truth, and you can discern it for yourself. You can figure out for yourself what you think about it. But you have to have some representative tell you what to think about it. So anyway, as a result, we're reading this 19th century work from Bronson Keeler called History of the Bible. And this is from 1881. And I found that Keeler is a little bit enchanted by what might be called atheism or scientific materialism, which is every bit as much a religion as Judaism or Christianity or Islam. But they claim that it's not. You claim that you're a skeptic, but basically, Christians believe that Jesus is going to save them, and Jews believe that Yahweh is going to save them, and atheists believe that science is going to save them. Now we're in the all-important 8th chapter, which he says he's going to be laying out really the history of the canon, the books, the 27 books of the New Testament that have made the cut and have been decided to be the true ones, whereas all the other ones are of limited value, if not no value, if not negative value. Okay, so the first collection of New Testament books ever made was by Marcion, the heretic, about the year 145 AD. And he uses the word heretic in quotes. He had just gotten done explaining that, Marcion himself would have considered himself a Christian, but he was called a heretic. So, that's mostly the case with the heretics, is that they were Christians, but they weren't called Christians because they had some kind of heterodox belief about something that was different than what the powers that be wanted them to believe. So they branded them as, it's kind of just like being called a conspiracy theorist. It's a way to diminish your ideas. Okay, so Marcion the heretic, about the year 145 AD. It consisted of 1 gospel and 10 of Paul's epistles. And they were not then considered the Word of God. He's gone over that in previous chapters as well, that both with the Old Testament and the New Testament, they were not considered to be inspired works, and people would change them if they felt like if they were improving them, and they would do so openly, something that today would be considered the utter blasphemy, just for some priest to just start, altering one of these sacred texts. But they weren't considered sacred. They might have been considered, inspired in a certain way, like he mentions, inspired in the same way that maybe Shakespeare is inspired, or Milton, I believe he uses, but not like divinely inspired, not unalterable. And so the quote here from Davidson, faith in the divine authority or inspiration of current books had not yet arisen. Marcion did not consider Paul's epistles inspired or of divine authority. This was more than 75 years after Paul was dead. The epistles which Marcion accepted were Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. He omitted 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews, which we have since called genuine and placed in the Bible. The first three of those, the pastoral epistles. His gospel has been the subject of much controversy. The Orthodox people asserting that it was Luke's mutilated, and the unbelievers denying this and asserting that it was the manuscript from which Luke's gospel was subsequently made up. Now, those two things are basically saying the same thing. One is logical and one really isn't. Was it Luke? So they're saying that he took Luke and mutilated it, and the other group of people is saying that Luke took him and added to it. Which do you think is more likely? So the facts are these. Marcion's gospel had no name. Indeed, as St. Chrysostom, which I think is a 5th century church father, observes, none of the apostles affixed their signatures to the gospels now bearing their names. That was the work of the church long afterward, and we have simply the church's word that they are genuine. And we don't even have that, because it says the gospel according to Mark or Luke, meaning that it's not their word, it's according to them, meaning that they got it from somewhere else. And most scholars will tell you that Mark came from Peter. Mark was informed by Peter, and Luke was informed by Paul. Paul, who wasn't even there in the first place, except to persecute them. And thus we find that in Marcion's time, more than a century after Jesus was dead, even if a gospel by Luke were in existence, his name had not yet been attached to it. If Marcion's gospel were Luke's gospel, the question arises, how did it happen that a heretic was in possession of a genuine gospel before the church itself was? And was his heresy anything more than in the name? Marcion's gospel was identical, word for word, with about 3/4 of the present gospel of Luke. And it was shorter than Luke. Now, you also remember that the Gospel of Mark, Luke is about 50 or 60% copy of the Gospel of Mark. And so this creates a puzzle. I'd like to know how similar Marcion's Gospel is to Mark. Anyway, now the reader knows how annotations made on the margin of a manuscript find their way into the text in the process of copying, and thus in time increase the length of a work, so that of two manuscripts of the same book, one shorter than the other, the shorter is generally the older, obviously. As I have said, Marcion's Gospel was the shorter. The charge has been made that Marcion purposely mutilated Paul's epistles and Luke's gospel to suit his doctrinal needs. It originated with Irenaeus, 2nd century church father, and was repeated with great violence by Tertullian, early 3rd century, and Epiphanius. I'm not sure when he lived, but I'm guessing 3rd century, and has been reiterated by theologians ever since, until very recently orthodoxy itself begins to admit that it is not true. So far from Marcion being a heretic, he included in his canonical list all that he considered to be the genuine Christian books. And he gives indications of having been a much more careful scholar than his accusers. The epistle which we now call to the Ephesians, he called to the Laodiceans. And he prided himself on having restored its true name. He omitted from his gospel the parable of the prodigal son, and from the epistle to the Romans, the last 2 chapters, either because they were not there in his time, or because he was satisfied they were interpolations. Some illustrations of the charges against him will indicate their worthless character. Tertullian says that he eliminated from Luke's gospel the saying of Jesus that he came not to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. That passage is not in Luke, but in Matthew. Yet Tertullian actually repeats this charge on 3 subsequent occasions. He says that Marcion must expunge, "I am not sent, but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And it is not meet to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. They also are not in Luke, but in Matthew. And the last is, I think, pretty important, because this is where he's talking to a Samaritan, and he says he's referring to them as dogs, kind of separating Jesus, referring to them as dogs, saying that, if you're not a Jew, then, you're pretty much a dog, and you're not worthy of the gospel. And this has been seen as a verse that kind of shows Jesus' Jewishness. I could be wrong about that. Maybe that's just my interpretation. I mean, it's just coming from a Roman origins perspective, where Jesus is totally cooperating with the Romans, and he is, generally castigating the Jews. And so this is kind of an exception to the rule here, that this verse in Matthew where he says, "Give it to the dogs," because Jesus is actually being more Jewish here with his epithets to the Samaritans. And so this is kind of going against the Roman origins hypothesis, but then when you see that, this is a disputed verse, anyway, Epiphanius likewise charges him with having omitted a passage which in reality is in Matthew and not in Luke. So this seems to be a pattern here. The charge that he mutilated the canonical list and those books which he accepted will not stand. There is another noteworthy thing. No writer before Marcion's time makes mention of the gospel according to Luke, and no writer after him does so until Irenaeus, nearly 50 years later. These are the facts. Many think they are sufficient to give ground for suspicion that someone afterwards took Marcion's gospel and forged Luke's name to it. Others do not. The reader can decide for himself. Well, this seems to throw a little bit of cold water on the Roman origins hypothesis, or needing to figure out where this Marcion gospel came from, why it's shorter than Luke, but it didn't come out till 145 AD. I think Roman Piso might have something to say about it, but because Roman Piso really just kind of says that all of the Apocrypha, all of these other Gospels, they were also written by the Romans. And, my hypothesis is that the Romans maybe had like some kind of contest to write Gospels, and they took the 4 that they liked the best or whatever, and or maybe wove the one that they liked the best and wove it into, or the 2 that they liked the best and wove them into 4, and then discarded the rest and put them in Egypt to be discovered as the Nag Hammadi texts, which were discovered not till 1945, just 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. That's a very fanciful theory that may have absolutely no evidence. That's just pure conjecture on my part. The first Old Testament list by a Christian writer was by Melito, Bishop of Sardis, around 175 AD. He wrote to Onesimus, and now you may remember that Onesimus is the name of, I believe, a slave in somewhere in the Pauline epistles, and Onesimus is told that he needs to obey his master, something to that effect. I'll have to brush up on my Paul, but this name Onesimus. So this is the Melito, Bishop of Sardis. As you were desirous of having an exact statement of the Old Testament, how many in number, and in what order the books were written, I have endeavored to perform this. When, therefore, I went to the east and came as far as the place where these things were proclaimed and done, I accurately ascertained the books of the Old Testament and sent them to thee here below. The names are as follows. Of Moses, 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Joshua, Judges, Ruth. 4 of Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. 2 of Chronicles, the Psalms of David, Proverbs, Solomon, which is also called Wisdom, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Job, of Prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, of the 12 prophets, 1 book, Daniel, Ezekiel, Ezra, Nehemiah. Okay, so he's got the order a little bit different than what we have, but this is in 175 AD. There are 3 things to which I wish to call the reader's attention. So late as the year 175 AD, a bishop in the Christian church could not say what books were in the Old Testament till he had traveled to the east and made inquiries. In giving the list accurately, he omits Esther and Lamentations. 3, he was so little versed in the sacred writings that he did not know that Proverbs and the Wisdom of Solomon were 2 entirely different books. Irenaeus was the real founder of the New Testament canon. His date is from 180 to 200 AD. Of our Gospels, Luke was probably compiled or written about 170 AD, Mark about 175, John about 178, and Matthew about 180. Now that is very, very, very different than the history that exists now, where that Mark was written first in the 70s, not the 170s, but the 70s. and Luke, Matthew next, and then Luke, and then John, all within the next 30 years or so. And the Roman origins hypothesis somewhat depends upon that. So here he says, Irenaeus began to use them within a very short time after the origin, though it was probably not till the year 200 that he knew of them all. He used them exclusively, and his canon consisted of the 4 Gospels, Acts, 13 epistles of Paul, rejecting Hebrews. Okay, so I guess there are 14 epistles of Paul. I thought there were 13. 1 John and Revelation. In an appendix, he placed Professor Davidson thinks as of less authority 2 John, 1 Peter, and the Shepherd of Hermas. The epistle to the Hebrews, which is apocryphal. The epistle to the Hebrews, Jude, James, 2 Peter, and 3 John he ignored. As the reader sees, this is the first time we meet with anything like a recognition of our present canon, and Irenaeus rejected several books which we now call divine. As he is the earliest writer to mention the 4 Gospels, Orthodox theologians now assert that they must have been in use before and recognized as sources of authority, because they say it would not have been possible if, as unbelievers assert, other Gospels had been in use before, to discard those others and to substitute a new series in their places. The reply to this is that it was not only possible, but it is what occurred, as history testifies. The intense rivalry between the different sects in the first 2 centuries, and especially between the Paulines, Petrines, and Johannines, had taught them that neither could master the other, and neither could hold exclusively to its special books and insist on their adoption. The result was a compromise, just as in a presidential convention, when the friends of the leading candidates find that neither of the favorites can be nominated, they unite on an entirely new man, one who before has hardly been mentioned. The Catholic Church was just forming about 170 AD by the union of the small sects and churches into one great body, and the necessity of some written source of authority of a Bible recognized by all